In 1272, the ninth and final crusade nears its end, and before returning home from the Holy Land, Edward I learns of his father's passing, and that he has now been made King of England. But instead of returning home immediately, he makes numerous stops in Italy and France, and in the historical region of Savoy, he comes into contact with the master mason James of St. George, a relationship that will benefit both of them for years to come. And it is not Edward, but James, that this story is about. When asked to imagine a medieval castle, there are few examples in European history as definitive of medieval fortification as those constructed under the supervision of James of St. George. While his name is known to few, his works remain eminent all across Europe, especially the expansive castle projects of Wales in the 13th century. Yet the story of his life is an obscure one, and not much is known about the man, often overshadowed by the story of King Edward and his many castles, despite James being the chief architect behind them. His story begins in the early 1230s in Savoy, a duchy ruled by the House of Savoy, located southeast of modern-day France, but not actually a part of France until as late as 1860. Little direct information exists about his birth, so this estimate comes mainly from what we know about his father John, a renowned master mason in his own right. James would have apprenticed under his father until he was old enough to become a mason himself, yet they would continue to collaborate even beyond that. Their greatest project together would be the castle at Yverdon in now western Switzerland, a project enlisted to them in 1259 by Peter II, Count of Savoy. It was constructed as a square with 4 towers, one of which was designed as a keep, thus taller than the rest and separated from the castle by means of a drawbridge. This way, it would be easy to take refuge in the tower in order to survive a siege. A few years later, information of his father's life becomes non-existent, and whether he died or simply took work elsewhere is unknown to this day. What is known is that James was tasked with completing the castle on his own, and when Peter died and was succeeded by Count Philip I, Philip would likely have entrusted James with building numerous other castles in Savoy, as the years, locations, and designs of them line up strongly. He also enlisted James to build a personal castle at the town of St. George's d'Esparanche. The design would follow Yverdon Castle almost exactly, albeit without the strategic elements, as this was meant more as a palace, rather than for any military purposes. This is also where the name of James of St. George comes from, as it was by far his greatest achievement to date, and a place he would end up living at himself. St. George specifically was a Roman soldier who became a Christian martyr. Strangely enough, I was unable to find any clues as to the current state of this castle, or even its exact location within the town it was supposedly based. So, I went searching on Google Maps throughout the town in its modern state, in hopes of finally finding it, but this too led to nothing. That was until I found this single old photo depicting what the castle would have looked like when it was first built, on top of a very old picture of the town in question. So I tried to find the most distinctive part of the town, this church, and utilizing my supreme Googling skills, I found it. After lining up the church with the surrounding houses, lo and behold, there it was. While it seems that 3 of the towers are gone, one still remains highly intact. One of the castle walls have also disappeared, but the others seem to have been turned into some sort of apartment complex, along with a school at the far end. As the castle neared completion in the early 1270s, a remarkable guest stepped into the halls, Edward I of England. Edward had come to visit his great-uncle Philip after fighting in the Crusades, for Philip to pay him homage to a treaty from years earlier. Edward was accompanied by his chief officer and close friend, Otto the grandson, who hailed from Savoy himself. Otto was part of the Savoyard knights that had come to serve under the English crown due to Edward's mother, who was a close relative to the Counts of Savoy. It is very likely that James and Edward must have met at some point during the stay, perhaps through Count Philip introducing the two, because just a few years later, James would become an integral part of history, as he was enlisted as the chief castle builder of Edward. A conquest was being led against the country of Wales, whose struggle and fight for autonomy were at a final stand. In order to bring Wales to a final submission after the waging war, Edward commenced a construction plan that would surround the entire Gwynedd region, the greatest source of resistance. The plan was to build multiple castles all around the region, a project that came to be known as the Ring of Iron. And to Edward it seems there was only one man right to oversee the job. Alas, James of St. George was off with his wife Ambrosia to begin the most monumental project of his life. While it is not entirely true that James built each and every castle from the ground up, the vast majority he either designed from the beginning or supervised the construction process of in order to reinforce the design. It began in 1277 with multiple designs over the region, the first being Castle Flint in the county of Flintshire. This one in particular there is no doubt that James had a hand in, as it resembles his designs in Savoy almost exactly, particularly the Castle of Yverdon, both sharing 4 towers with one separated as the keep. This one took 7 years to complete and was formed together with a plantation town for English settlers, meaning a town that was deliberately planned out, unlike the many that simply naturally came about over many years. In Flintshire would also be built another castle called Harden Castle. Built is not quite right, as it was not actually made for the Ring of Iron initially. In fact, much of its original history is lost, with ties going back as far as the Iron Age. How it evolved since then is difficult to say, as a conflict between Llewellyn the Last and the English lords would have led to the original castle being destroyed in 1265. More than 10 years later is when Edward would have the castle refortified, again by James of St. George. When it comes to both Rhuddlan Castle and Beauath Castle, a common theme comes up, as some of the castles were not actually built from scratch, but upon existing ground, where previously there would have been motte and bailey castles likely of Norman descent, with long histories of their own. For the Iron Ring, Edward took the opportunity to have these castles refortified by James to create powerful strongholds. Almost all these castles are still standing in some form too, albeit some more ruinous than others. Beauath is something of a modern anomaly, however, with none of its original stonework still standing, and only by reading the sole sign at the site can you tell that a great castle once stood upon the complex earthwork. Multiple of the castles were in fact of Norman origin, as before the time of Edward, the Norman invasions of Wales led to the very first castles being built in the country. Rhuddlan and Aberystwyth, 2 of the first 5 castles that began construction in 1277, would hold a design that many of the future castles would go forward with. This was an incredibly strong form of defense known as concentric castles, with 2 rings of walls to allow for a larger number of guards that could then fire onto attackers without hitting their own men. And, were one to make it past the first wall, you would be met with yet another even stronger wall lined with archers. This design was employed greatly in the Crusades, and James would use it for many of Edward's castles, possibly at Edward's behest as he fought within the Crusades himself. The 5 newer castles are also the most famous of the Ring of Iron, starting with Denbigh in 1282, soon after construction finished for the previous 5, then followed by Carnarvon, Conwy, Harlech, and Beaumaris, all now designated as World Heritage Sites. It is hardly difficult to see why, as these northern castles remain by far the most intact and well preserved. James's pay would also rise when it came to building these newer castles. For his work, James was initially paid the generous sum of 2 shillings a day. For reference, an ordinary craftsman who was not a master would earn the amount comparable to 2 shillings in a full week of work. But once the construction of the original castles finished and work continued to even greater projects, he was appointed Master of Royal Works, and so even this lofty salary was raised, earning him 3 shillings a day. Despite its majestic appearance, Carnarvon was not quite as capable defensively as its brothers, as this was intended mainly as a seat of power, placed in a highly strategic position. The agriculture of the land was rich, and the Menai Strait allowed swift passage between the north and west coasts of Wales. In fact, all castles worked on by James, other than Beaumaris, stood either by or very close to the shore, as supplies came by sea, and in order to make such enormous castles, materials for building had to come by sea as well. As the castles were being built in enemy territory, it was also necessary to put up wooden barricades to prevent attacks before construction was even finished. With a single look, you can tell that Conwy Castle is incredibly indicative of medieval castle design. Not only does it look as something you would see in fantasy tales of dragons and knights, but it is also one of the strongest castles defensively that James ever built, with high walls and as many as 8 massive towers. This was put to the test when Edward was besieged during a rebellion in 1295, where the firm walls would prove the savior. The fact that the towers and walls are still fully intact today speaks to the testament of James' strong understanding of military architecture. The castle was not actually even made with the concentric design of the others, as the outcrop upon which it stood did not allow it. But this hardly limited its defensive capabilities, as it instead had 2 outer defenses at each end of the castle, with a drawbridge at the west side and a gate called a portcullis. Along with the castle, a long wall was built around the adjacent town, made to protect the English colony from the Welsh, who were angered by the English tyranny. Perhaps highlighting James's military prowess even further is the castle of Harlech. Once again, this used the concentric form, and not only was it possible to attack only a single side of the fortress because of the cliff face, but that same side was protected by multiple heavy doors and 3 portcullises. Harlech Castle happens to be a central place in the legend of Branwen, a heroine from Welsh mythology in the Mabinogion texts. It is important to note that James's skill was not only in architecture, but also in organizing the men he needed for the actual building process. Of particular note are Walter of Hereford and Richard of Chester, 2 master masons who served under James, and would likely have overseen the upkeep of the castles. Their work would presumably have involved working on the more specific elements of the castles, as James had a massive task of overseeing all of them at once. This teamwork cannot be understated, as the project would surely not have been possible without it. Despite his many great works, funnily enough, perhaps his most exemplary project was a castle that never finished. At the island of Anglesey stands the final fortress of the Iron Ring, Beaumaris Castle. It being so short may give the impression that it saw a lot of damage over the years, but in fact it is not actually a ruin at all. The castle was simply never finished. Had it been completed, it would easily have rivaled the likes of Conwy and Harlech. It was wholly unrestricted by difficult terrain, giving James and Edward the freedom to construct what was to be a masterpiece. Inside there was a chapel and a great hall, and it was a perfectly symmetrical concentric design, with a massive moat and a heavily guarded gatehouse. But money was running thin. Edward's wars in Scotland were costly for the entire kingdom, and the castles themselves were already expensive to begin with. A letter from Master James gives a good indication of the great labour and money at work for Beaumaris. "We write to inform you that the work we are doing is very costly, and we need a great deal of money. In case you should wonder where so much money could go in a week, we would have you know that we have needed, and shall continue to need, 400 masons, both cutters and layers, together with 2,000 minor workmen, 100 carts, 60 wagons, and 30 boats for bringing in stone and sea coal, 200 quarrymen, 30 smiths, and carpenters for putting in joists and floorboard and other necessary jobs. All this takes no account of the garrison mentioned above, nor of the purchase of material, of which there will have to be a great quantity. The men's pay has been, and still is, very much in arrears, and we are having the greatest difficulty in keeping them, because they simply have nothing to live on. And sirs, for God's sake be quick with the money for the works, otherwise everything done up till now will have been of no avail." Indeed, it seems that the money and workforce needed became more than was possible with the economical state of the kingdom, and work eventually had to cease. And unfortunately, the story of James soon also comes to a halt as well. James was at some point in the early 14th century requested by Edward to come to Scotland after Beaumaris stopped construction, as he wanted his assistance in overseeing castles for the conflict there. Most notably was Linlithgow Palace in Edinburgh. and though his exact role at the site is not fully known, since he was present at the time of its conception, he would likely have played a role in its design, perhaps to oversee its military aspects. James passed on May 20th of 1309, only 2 years after Edward himself. He died surrounded by the castles that he himself had constructed, and in Beaumaris there is a statue dedicated to the Master Mason, sculpted by Sebastian Boysen in 2016. Now, what other projects he may have worked on are unfortunately no more than speculation. What is known, however, is that he had 2 sons, of which info is scarce, as well as that his wife passed around the same time as him. Records related to non-royalty were not as meticulous, so there is surely a great deal of fascinating details missing from history. As with many great designers, his works are far more famous than himself. I believe it only right that James of St. George gets the appreciation he deserves, as he was by far one of the greatest castle architects of what is by now a nearly forgotten world.